She insulted the human, then watched him walk away without a word. The meeting room on Station Velhari 9 smelled like recycled air and old arguments. Lieutenant Colin Reeves stood near the far wall, arms folded, eyes forward, watching the Drathian ambassador finish her speech. He had not moved in 4 minutes. He had not spoken in 7. His coffee sat on the table in front of his empty chair, going cold, and nobody in that room could figure out if that made him dangerous or simply rude. Ambassador Veilka of the Drathian Collective did not care which one it was. She stood at the head of the long oval table, her 4 arms arranged in a posture her people called the open display, a sign of superiority made to look like invitation. Her pale blue skin caught the overhead lights and threw them back, and when she spoke, her voice carried the polished weight of someone who had ended careers before breakfast. "The human delegation," she said, turning her wide dark eyes toward Colin, "has contributed nothing of value to this discussion. I expected at least a rudimentary understanding of the treaty clauses. What I received instead was silence and the smell of that drink your species cannot seem to function without." A few of the other delegates shifted in their seats. A Tharnic observer clicked her mandibles once, which among her people was the equivalent of a wince. The Usul representative, a tall gray being with no visible face, leaned slightly away from the Drathian ambassador, as if trying not to be associated with what had just been said. Colin looked at Veilka. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, long enough to make it clear he had heard every word. Then he uncrossed his arms, picked up his cold coffee, took a slow sip, set the cup back down without making a sound, turned and walked out of the room. No raised voice, no sharp reply, no dramatic pause at the door, he just left. The door sealed behind him with a soft hiss. Veilka stared at the closed door, then she looked at the other delegates, then she looked at the door again. "Well," she said, and for the first time in 11 years of diplomatic service, she could not find a second word to follow it. The Tharnic observer clicked her mandibles again. This time it meant something else entirely. Colin walked down the corridor with his hands in his pockets. The station was a long cylinder, all curved floors and humming ventilation, and the faint blue glow of navigation lights running along the ceiling at regular intervals. He counted the lights as he passed them. It was something he did when he needed to keep his face calm and his thoughts organized, a habit he had picked up in his first year of service, when his commanding officer told him that the most powerful thing a person could do in a tense room was leave it quietly. He had not forgotten that lesson. He stopped at a viewport at the end of the corridor and looked out at the star field. Velhari 9 orbited a dim red dwarf, and from this angle the star was just a soft red smear at the lower edge of the view, the rest of the window filled with cold dark and the distant lights of 2 other vessels holding position nearby. One was a Drathian cruiser, long and angular, and painted in the deep indigo his government had been briefed on. The other was the Heather Ann, a human survey vessel that had no business being this close to the negotiation zone, but was there anyway because Captain Donna Ruiz did not believe that posted boundaries applied to her personally. Colin was glad she was there. He pulled out his comm device and sent her a short message. It read, "Situation developing, stay close." He put the device away and kept looking at the stars. Behind him, footsteps. He recognized the weight of them without turning, heavy, deliberate, spaced in the particular rhythm of someone who was not in a hurry, but wanted to appear as though they had important places to be. "Lieutenant Reeves." He turned. It was Odin Yell, the Usul representative, standing in the corridor with his long gray hands folded in front of him. The Usul had no faces in the traditional sense, only a smooth curved surface where features might have been, with faint lines of bioluminescence that shifted color depending on emotional state. Right now those lines were a pale amber, which Colin had learned meant cautious curiosity. "Representative Yell," Colin said. "You left the meeting." "I did." Odin Yell was quiet for a moment. The amber lines deepened slightly toward orange. The ambassador was pointed in her remarks. Many would have responded. Many would have, Colin agreed. But you did not. No. Another pause. The Usul tilted his head at a slight angle. I have studied human behavior for 9 of your years. I confess I did not predict that response. I modeled aggression, defensive argument, perhaps an appeal to the neutral observers. I did not model silence and departure. Colin looked back out the viewport briefly. My grandmother used to say that the loudest thing you can do in an argument is say nothing and walk away. Odin Yell processed that. His bioluminescence shifted toward a warm gold, which Colin had also learned, and which meant something close to appreciation. Your grandmother was wise. She was a retired school principal from Central Ohio, Colin said. She had 31 years of practice with people who wanted to pick fights. The Usul representative made a sound that was not quite a laugh but was clearly its cousin. The ambassador will interpret your departure as weakness. She will press harder in the next session. Colin nodded slowly. I know. And this does not concern you. It concerns me quite a bit, Colin said. I just think she's wrong about what it means. He left Odin Yell standing at the viewport with his bioluminescence gone fully gold, watching the human walk away for the second time in 20 minutes, and this time looking considerably less confused about it. Back in the meeting room, Veilka had resumed the session with 2 of the minor delegates, walking them through the resource allocation framework that the Drathine had spent 3 months preparing. She was efficient. She was thorough. She was also, in the very back of her mind, thinking about that door. She had insulted diplomats before. It was not cruelty, she would not have described it that way, it was strategy. Pressure applied early told you what the other party was made of. Some flinched, some bristled. Some argued and gave away information in the heat of it. What they did not do, in her considerable experience, was nothing. Nothing was not in the standard response set. She moved through the framework with practiced ease, but the gold glow from the Usul observer's face caught her eye twice, and both times it made her feel something she could not quite name. In a small side room 3 corridors away, Colin Reeves opened his mission case, took out a data tablet and began writing notes. Not about the insult, not about Veilka. He wrote about the resource allocation framework she had been presenting before she had pivoted to dismissing him, because he had been listening the whole time, and 3 of the subclauses she had glossed over contained the actual leverage points in the treaty, and she had moved past them fast enough to suggest she was hoping no one noticed. He had noticed. He wrote for 40 minutes, then he reviewed what he wrote, then he sent a compressed summary to his government liaison with a note that said, "We have more ground than they want us to know about. Prepare the technical annex for session 2. Then he poured the rest of his cold coffee into the small room's recycling drain, made a fresh cup from the station dispenser in the hallway, came back, sat down, and read through the framework again from the beginning. He did not think about Veilka's words. Or rather, he thought about them in the way that was useful as data, not as wounds. She had said he contributed nothing of value. She would have the chance to revise that opinion. He intended to give it to her in a setting of his choosing, at a time of his choosing, with documentation she could not dismiss. For now, he drank his coffee while it was still hot, and let the quiet do its work. The second session was scheduled for the following morning, station time. Colin arrived 8 minutes early. He had slept 6 hours, which was normal for him. He had eaten breakfast alone in the station's small common mess, reconstituted eggs, and something that was nearly toast. And he had read through the full technical annex twice, and the cultural briefing on Drathine negotiation practices once more, paying particular attention to a section he had skimmed on his first read 3 weeks ago. The section was titled Hierarchical Correction Protocols, and it explained that in Drathine diplomatic culture, when a senior figure made a public error, the correct response from a junior figure was never direct challenge. Direct challenge created what the briefing called a dominance loop, an escalating exchange that could only end with one party fully capitulating or the negotiation collapsing entirely. The correct response, according to the briefing, was what the Drathine called a quiet record, the presentation of contradicting information in a non-confrontational format that allowed the senior figure to absorb it privately and adjust without losing standing. Colin had underlined the phrase non-confrontational format and written 2 words next to it in the margin. They were like walking out. He was still thinking about that when he sat down in the meeting room and arranged his materials and looked up to find Ambassador Velka watching him from across the table with an expression he could not yet read. She had 4 eyes, 2 forward-facing primary eyes and 2 lateral secondary eyes set further back on her skull. The primary eyes were the ones she used for focused attention. All 4 were pointed at him right now, which in the briefing was described as full assessment posture and was considered either high threat or high interest depending on context. He nodded at her once, the way you would nod at a colleague you had no particular feelings about, and opened his tablet. She made a small sound. He did not look up. The other delegates filed in over the next 5 minutes. Odin Yell took his seat, and his bioluminescence opened at a light gold. The Tharnic observer sat nearest the door, which Colin understood was a positioning habit of her species. They preferred clear exit routes. 2 Drathine technical advisors took chairs behind Velka and arranged their materials with the precise movements of people who had done this hundreds of times. The session was called to order by the neutral facilitator, a Emrevian named Tesk who communicated via translation implant and had the pleasant, exhausted energy of someone who had been doing this job for too long and loved it anyway. "We return," Tesk said, "to the resource allocation framework as presented yesterday. At the close of the previous session, 1 delegation had departed early. The floor is open." Velka straightened. She clearly expected Colin to say something first, an apology, a complaint, an explanation. She had arranged her 4 arms in the open display again. Colin said, "I have some questions about subclauses 14, 19, and 22. Not I want to address yesterday, not I believe there was some misunderstanding, not with respect, Ambassador. Just the questions." Velka's lateral eyes shifted slightly. Her primary eyes stayed forward. She said in a measured tone, "The subclauses are straightforward." "They seem that way," Colin agreed. "I did have a technical reading question on 14, though. The framework specifies extraction ratios for the 3 contested mineral veins in the Haven Belt, but the baseline calculations use 2019 cycle yield data. The current cycle is running about 30% lower due to the debris field from the North incident. I want to make sure we're working from the same numbers." A silence. Not the silence of people who didn't know the answer. The silence of people working out what it meant that the question had been asked at all. Velka's technical advisor leaned forward and said something quietly in the Drathine language. Velka did not respond to her. She kept looking at Colin with all 4 eyes. He looked back. "Where did you obtain cycle data for the current period?" she said. It was not quite a question. "The Heather Ann has been conducting survey operations in the Haven region," he said. "Captain Ruiz forwarded a summary 2 weeks ago. I can share the relevant pages if it would help the discussion." Another silence. Odin Yell's bioluminescence had gone fully orange, which Colin now suspected was its version of holding its breath. Velka leaned back. It was a small movement, barely visible, but it changed the geometry of her posture in a way the briefing had described as repositioning from advance. She said, "Share the pages." Colin shared them. The next 3 hours were the most productive hours of the negotiation. Not because tempers cooled or because everyone suddenly liked each other, they didn't, and they weren't pretending otherwise. Productive because the subclauses got revised, and the revised versions were more accurate, and Veilka's technical advisor quietly flagged 2 additional corrections that needed to be made to adjacent sections. And by the time Tess called a midday break, 6 of the 9 contested framework points had been substantially adjusted. None of this was announced as a victory. None of it was framed as anyone being wrong. It was just numbers, and then better numbers, and then a framework that actually reflected what was true. During the break, Colin stood at a water dispenser in the corridor, and Veilka came to stand beside him. She did not speak immediately. She drew a cup of water. The station provided Drathing-compatible water in a separate marked tap, and she drank some of it and looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, "The Heather Ann was not supposed to be in the Haven region." "No," Colin agreed. "But she was there. Captain Ruiz has her own relationship with posted boundaries," he said. Veilka made a sound. It was not a laugh exactly, but it was not nothing. "You were listening yesterday," she said, "during my presentation." "The whole time," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Her secondary eyes moved just slightly toward him. "I said something ungenerous." He looked at her. "You did." She did not apologize. He had not expected her to. In Drathing culture, what she had just done, acknowledging the thing directly, without softening or excuse, was itself the apology. It was the quiet record in reverse. She had just handed him something, and they both knew it, and neither of them was going to make it awkward by naming it out loud. He nodded once. She nodded once. They went back into the meeting room. In the afternoon session, Veilka called on him 3 times by name to clarify technical points, and each time she said, "Lieutenant Reeves," in a voice that had none of the theatrical weight it had carried the previous day. It was just a name. It was just a colleague. On the Heather Ann, Captain Donna Ruiz received a brief message from her liaison at the end of the station day. It read, "Negotiations progressing. Survey data was useful. Stand by for further requests." She leaned back in her captain's chair and smiled. She had known Colin Reeves for 6 years. She had watched him walk into hard rooms and come out having done something nobody quite expected. She had asked him once how he did it. He had said, "You listen more than you talk, and you wait longer than feels comfortable, and you don't let anybody else's picture of you become your picture of yourself." She had written it down and taped it to the inside of her locker, where it still was. She sent a message back, "Ready when you need us." In his small side room, Colin Reeves updated his notes, reviewed the framework revisions for accuracy, and sent the updated annex to his government liaison. Then he set his tablet face down on the table and sat quietly for a while, drinking his coffee, watching the red dwarf sun drift slowly past the small porthole in the wall. The 3rd session was 2 days away. He had things to prepare. But first, the quiet. It had been a useful day. Not loud, not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would make a good story if you needed a hero who shouted. But the subclauses were better now. The numbers were true. 6 out of 9 points moved in the right direction. That was enough. He finished his coffee and got to work. The Drathing cruiser was called the Tessivar, which translated from the old Drathing formal language as the open hand before the strike. Colin had read that in the station's translated registry and made a small note of it, not because it changed anything, but because it confirmed something about how Veilka's people thought about approach. Every display of openness was also a form of preparation. He kept that in mind heading into the 3rd session, which was supposed to address the boundary demarcations for the Outer Haven Belt, and the question of which faction had rights to the monitoring stations already constructed there. The monitoring stations were the real issue. They always had been. Everything else, the yield ratios, the transit lanes, the communication protocols, was framework. The monitoring stations were the actual weight on the scale. There were 7 of them. 3 were built by Drathing contractors. 2 were built jointly with USL technical support. 1 had been placed by a Tharnic survey team under a license that had since expired. And 1, the one called M7, positioned at the inner edge of the North debris field, had been built 6 years ago by the Heather Ann's predecessor vessel, a ship called the Patris Acafer, using salvaged components from a station that had been decommissioned by mutual agreement. Technically, legally, under the frameworks that existed at the time of construction, M7 was registered to the Earth Diplomatic Corps. Nobody had mentioned it yet in the negotiations. Colin had not mentioned it. He had not mentioned it because there was a time for playing cards and a time for keeping them face down on the table, and for 2 sessions he had been doing other things, building trust where trust was available, establishing that his data was reliable, letting Veilka recalibrate her read of him. He had been patient in the way that only felt slow from the outside. The morning of the 3rd session, he woke up at 0500 station time and sat at his small desk and went through everything one more time. He had a mug of coffee. He had 7 pages of notes. He had a communication from his government liaison, confirming that the M7 registration documents had been located in the archives and were available for transmission on his request. He did not request them yet. He ate breakfast. He reviewed the Drathine cultural briefing one more time, particularly the section on threshold moments, their term for the point in a negotiation where the core issue finally surfaced. The briefing said Drathine diplomats treated threshold moments as tests of character. How the other party introduced the core issue told you what kind of partner they intended to be. He had been thinking about that for 2 days. He walked into the meeting room at 8 minutes before the session start and found, for the first time in the negotiation, that Veilka had arrived before him. She was standing near the viewport, looking out at the same star field Colin had looked at after he walked out of session 1. Her arms were not in the open display. They were folded in front of her in a posture he did not have a name for yet. "Lieutenant Reeves," she said without turning. "Ambassador," he said. "I have been reviewing the registry files for the monitoring stations," she said. "Comprehensive review, all 7. He set his tablet on the table. "That sounds thorough." "It was." She turned from the viewport. Her 4 eyes met his. "I found something I was not expecting." He waited. "M7, she said. "Yes," he said. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to categorize, not quite suspicion, not quite respect, somewhere in the territory between them. "You have known about this since before session 1, she said. "I have." "And you said nothing." "I was waiting," he said. "For what?" He thought about his grandmother and her 31 years of managing rooms full of people who wanted to fight. He thought about Captain Ruiz and the Patris Acafer and the salvaged components that had become a monitoring station at the edge of a debris field 6 years ago. He thought about Odin Yell standing at the viewport with gold bioluminescence, telling him the ambassador would press harder. "I was waiting to see what kind of partner you intended to be," he said. The room was quiet. The ventilation hummed. Somewhere down the corridor, 2 technicians were having a conversation in a language he didn't speak. Veilka stood very still for a moment. Then she unfolded her arms and moved to the table and sat down. She did not sit in the head position. She sat at the side, the way you sit when you're working instead of presiding. "The M7 station," she said, "provides coverage of the North debris field that none of the others can replicate from their current positions. Its data feed is integrated into the automated transit routing for the entire belt." "I know," he said. "If you produce the registration documents in open session," she said slowly, "I will have no counter. The station is yours, legally and technically. And with it, the monitoring leverage over the inner belt." "I know that too," he said. She looked at him. "Then why are we talking privately before session?" He sat down across from her. He laced his fingers together on the table and said, "Because I'd rather reach an agreement than win a point." Veilka was quiet for a long time. Odin Yell came in at that moment, registered the tableau, 2 people seated across from each other, no display postures, materials on the table, neither of them speaking, and his bioluminescence went immediately to a deep, warm gold. He sat down at the far end of the table and did not say a word, which was probably the wisest thing he had ever done. The session started on time. What followed was 4 hours of work that none of the briefing documents or cultural primers had prepared Colin for, because it turned out that when you offered a path that didn't require someone to lose, some people took it. Not all, not always, not without difficulty. But sometimes. The monitoring station agreement they drafted before the midday break established a joint operations protocol for M7. Earth held the registration. The Drathine Collective contributed operational staffing under a rotating agreement. Data output went to both parties simultaneously and was also shared with the Ussel and Tharnik observers as a confidence measure. The station's transit routing integration stayed intact. It was not a perfect agreement. Veilka pushed hard on 3 of the operational clauses and got changes on 2 of them that Colin had to spend 45 minutes thinking about before he was willing to accept. He accepted them because they were reasonable, not because she pressured him into it. There was a difference, and she seemed to understand that he could tell the difference, and that understanding made the second half of the session considerably more efficient. When Tess called the afternoon break, all 9 of the original contested framework points had been addressed. 7 were fully resolved. 2 remained open for a 4th session, but they were the smaller 2, the ones about maintenance cost sharing and the specific technical standards for communication encryption, and both parties had already exchanged draft positions in writing. Colin stepped out into the corridor during the break and found a message from Donna Ruiz on his comm device. It said, "You still alive in there?" He typed back, "Mostly. Might need you to host a joint working dinner on the Heather Ann at some point. Drathine contingent." A pause, then, "My kitchen replicator makes decent food for 8 species. Set the date." He pocketed the comm device and looked out the viewport at the end of the corridor. The Tessivar was still holding position. So was the Heather Ann. 2 ships from 2 very different civilizations, parked near each other without any particular drama, which when you thought about it was not nothing. It was actually quite a lot. He went back in for the afternoon session. When it was over, Veilka gathered her materials and stopped at the door. She looked at him across the length of the empty room. The other delegates had already gone. Tesk was somewhere down the hall. Odin Yell had paused to exchange something with the Tharnik observer, and she said, in a tone that was not warm but was not cold either, simply honest, "You are not what I expected." He picked up his tablet and his cold coffee. "I get that sometimes," he said. "I said you contributed nothing of value," she said. "On the first day." "You did." "I was incorrect." He looked at her, she looked at him. The bioluminescence from Odin Yell's direction had gone fully, deeply gold, the color of something genuine. "I know," Colin said, and he said it without weight, without a blade hidden in it. Just a plain acknowledgement between 2 people who had worked hard and gotten somewhere. Then he walked out. This time she didn't stare at the door. She watched him go with the particular expression of someone who has revised an opinion they held very firmly and found the revision, against all expectation, to be an improvement. The 4th session was supposed to be procedural. 2 remaining items, both technical in nature, both with drafted positions already on the table. Colin had gone into it expecting 4 hours of careful wordsmithing, and not much else. What he had not planned for was Veilka bringing someone new. She arrived with her 2 technical advisors, as before. But beside her walked a being he had not seen in 3 sessions, an older Drathine with darker blue skin and 6 arms instead of 4, which the briefing noted was characteristic of the elder caste Drathine who had passed a particular biological threshold in their lifespan. Elder caste members in a negotiation room were either there to observe or to close. He was introduced as Advocate Sharon. He did not sit at the table. He sat against the wall, in a chair that had been placed specifically for him, and he watched everything with the patient stillness of someone who had watched many things. Colin did not stare at him. He nodded once and returned his attention to his materials. Tesk opened the session and walked through the remaining items. The maintenance cost-sharing clause was the first. Colin had come in with a proposal that split the costs on a 3-year rotating basis, weighted against usage. Velka's team had proposed a fixed annual contribution from each party. The difference was mostly about who carried the cost burden when the stations required unexpected repairs, which, in a debris field like North, happened more often than anyone preferred. They went back and forth for 90 minutes. It was the least dramatic 90 minutes of the entire negotiation, 2 parties with clear positions, neither of them trying to obscure what they wanted, working toward a formula that could actually function. Colin gave on the fixed contribution model in principle and held on the emergency repair clause, and the version they arrived at was a hybrid that neither party's home office would love but both could live with. The encryption standards clause took another 2 hours. This one involved technical specificity that required Colin to pull in Captain Ruiz via comm at one point, because the Heather Ann survey equipment used a non-standard communication protocol that intersected with 2 of the proposed standards in a way that would have created problems for M7's data transmission. Donna Ruiz talked for 8 minutes, speaking fast and clearly, and with the particular precision of someone who understood the machinery intimately. And when she was done, Velka's technical advisor nodded in a way that meant the point was accepted. "Your captain," Velka said during a brief pause, "is direct." "She was born that way," Colin said. "The universe adjusted." He was not sure why he said it. It was a small joke, the kind of thing you say when tension has been running for hours and you need to let a little pressure off. He was slightly concerned it would land badly. Velka's primary eyes shifted and her mouth moved in a way that, according to the briefing, was the Drathian equivalent of a suppressed smile. "The universe does that," she said. The encryption clause was resolved by early afternoon. All 9 points were now closed. Tesk drafted the closure summary in real time and shared it with both parties for review. It took 20 minutes. Colin read every word, flagged 2 minor formatting issues, and confirmed the summary was accurate. Velka's team did the same. Odin Yell was requested to sign as a neutral observer and did so with his bioluminescence at a steady, warm gold. When the summary was countersigned and filed with the station's official record, Tesk said, "The Velhari 9 framework is provisionally adopted. A formal ratification session will be scheduled through standard channels. Congratulations to both delegations." The room did not erupt. There was no applause, no dramatic exhale of relief. Everyone was tired. It had been a long 4 days. Velka stood and picked up her materials. Her 2 technical advisors began packing their things. Advocate Sharon rose from his chair against the wall slowly, and for the first time since he had arrived, he moved toward the table. He came to stand before Colin. Advocate Sharon was tall, even for a Drathian. His 6 arms were arranged in a posture the briefing had described, but Colin had never seen in practice. The closed acknowledgement, arms folded inward across the body. It was used, according to the briefing, when a Drathian elder wanted to register something that was not quite approval and not quite gratitude but existed somewhere between them, in a territory their language had a word for and his did not. Colin stood up. Sharon looked at him for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in accented but clear universal common, "I have watched many negotiations. The human tendency is to rush the center, I have found, to push toward the decisive moment before the ground is prepared." Colin waited. "You did not do this," Sharon said. "No," Colin agreed. "You waited, you prepared the ground." Sharon tilted his head slightly. "This is not the human way in my experience." "Depends on the human," Colin said. Sharon made a small sound. It might have been approval. It was hard to tell. "Ambassador Velka has served the collective for 11 years, he said. "She is correct most of the time. She was not correct about you." She adjusted, Colin said. She did, Sharon straightened. We will see you at the ratification session, Lieutenant Reeves. He turned and followed Veilka out of the room. Colin stood alone at the table for a moment. Odin Yell had paused at the door and was watching him with full gold bioluminescence, which Colin had learned by now meant something close to warmth. You are going to have a long career, Odin Yell said. I'm going to need better coffee dispensers, Colin said. The Ussel laughed, which was a remarkable sound, something between a chime and a drum, bright and deep at the same time. He walked out. The Tharnic observer waved two of her hands at Colin from the doorway and followed. Colin began packing his materials. He thought about the first day. The way Veilka had spoken, pointed, deliberate, designed to diminish. He thought about the moment after, standing at the viewport, the stars cold and still, the Heather Ann visible in the lower right of the view. He thought about walking out of a room and choosing silence the way some people choose weapons, not because silence is passive, but because it preserves options. It leaves space. It doesn't burn ground you might need to walk back across later. He picked up his tablet and his empty coffee cup. He sent a message to Donna Ruiz, 4 days, framework adopted, set up the dinner. She replied in 40 seconds, already planned the menu, pick a date. My crew is excited to meet the Drathine delegation. He smiled. He wrote back, ask them if they have any dietary restrictions first. She wrote already did, we're covered. Of course she had. He walked out of the meeting room and down the corridor and stopped at the viewport one last time. The Tessavar was still there. The Heather Ann was still there. 2 ships from 2 places that had never particularly liked each other, held in the same orbit by a shared interest in not making things worse. That was where agreements lived, he thought, not in the moments of warmth, not in the handshakes and the formal photographs, in the shared interest in not making things worse, in the willingness to stay in the room even when someone made you feel small, in the decision to answer an insult with silence and a cold cup of coffee and a question about subclause 14. He thought about what Advocate Sharon had said, the human tendency is to rush the center. He thought that was probably true in general, but the tendency was not a requirement. You could choose a different pace. You could learn to sit with the discomfort of moving slowly and trust that what you were building would be sturdier for it. He had tried. Today it had worked. Tomorrow or next week or next year it might not work because nothing worked every time and the universe did not owe you consistency. But today it had worked. That was enough to take with him. The dinner on the Heather Ann was 3 weeks later. Donna Ruiz had converted the ship's main observation bay into something approximating a dining room, long folding tables, actual chairs scrounged from storage, lighting dialed down to something softer than the work lamps. She had the ship's cook put together a menu that ran across 6 species, with 2 separate preparation areas and labels on every dish in 4 languages. The Drathine delegation arrived first. Veilka came with her 2 technical advisors and one of the junior staff, a young Drathine named Arev who had not spoken once during the formal sessions, but who, it turned out, had been taking meticulous notes and now wanted to ask Colin 47 technical questions about human survey methodology. Colin answered all 47. He did not hurry through any of them. Odin Yell came with a colleague from the Ussel Diplomatic Service, who had just arrived at Velhari 9 for the ratification preparation. The Tharnic observer came alone, which was typical, and spent most of the evening examining the ship's mechanical systems, with an enthusiasm that Donna Ruiz found charming enough to indulge by walking her through the engine room personally. The meal was loud in the way that meals are loud when people have been working hard in close quarters, and the formal portion is done. Multiple conversations going at once, translation devices working steadily, someone at the far end of the table having discovered that the Ussel dietary supplement they had brought looked almost exactly like a human condiment called balsamic glaze, and were discussing this at length with visible excitement on both sides. Colin sat near the middle of the table and ate his food and listened to the room. Veilka sat across from him. She ate carefully. Drathin ate carefully as a cultural norm, taking small portions and considering each one, and she watched the room too, in the particular way of someone who was revising their expectations of what a human gathering looked like. "Your crew," she said at one point. "They're good people," Colin said. "They are informal." "That's one word for it," he said. "The cook," Veilka said, glancing toward the service area, "asked me personally if I enjoyed the sauce. Asked me, as though my answer would change the recipe." "Would it?" She considered. "He said he would adjust it next time if I preferred." "And would you prefer an adjustment?" Veilka looked at him. Her secondary eyes moved in a way he had come to recognize as her version of weighing something. "It was good," she said. "I would not require an adjustment." "I'll let him know," Colin said. She made the small mouth movement that was her version of a suppressed smile. It was the second time he had seen it. The evening wound down slowly, the way good evenings do, conversations tapering off one by one without any decisive moment of ending. People gathered their things gradually. Arav asked Colin for contact information for the survey team, and Colin gave it to him, and also sent a note to Donna Ruiz telling her to expect a follow-up inquiry about methodology, which she received on her comm device at the table and held up with an expression of delight. At the door of the observation bay, Veilka paused. She looked at Colin with all four eyes for a moment. Her arms were in the folded inward position, not the closed acknowledgement of Advocate Sharon's elder formality, but something less precise, more personal, the gesture of someone who was still learning which shape fit the moment. "Lieutenant Reeves," she said. "Ambassador," he said. "When the ratification session is scheduled," she said, "I would prefer it if your delegation retained you as the point representative." He looked at her. "I'll pass that along." "Do," she said. And then, in a tone that was not quite casual and not quite formal, somewhere in a space her language probably had a name for, "You are aggravating to negotiate with." He raised an eyebrow. "You do not perform," she said. "It is difficult to read you, and I prefer to read the people I work with." "I'll try to be more predictable," he said. She gave him the full, not suppressed version of the smile. It was the first time he had seen it, and it was remarkable, wider than he expected, slightly asymmetrical, the kind of expression that had never been performed for a diplomatic audience and had simply arrived. "Do not," she said, and walked off the ship. Colin stood at the Heather Ann's airlock and watched the Drathin delegation make their way along the docking corridor toward the station. He could hear Donna Ruiz behind him, talking to one of her crew, and the sound of the kitchen being cleaned up, and from somewhere in the ship, the distant hum of the engines running on low. He thought about the first day again, the meeting room and the cold coffee and the door. He had walked out of that room and stood at a viewport and counted the lights in the ceiling and waited for his face to return to its normal configuration. He had sent a message to Donna Ruiz that said stay close. He had listened to Odin Yell tell him the ambassador would press harder. She had pressed. He had pushed back quietly at angles she did not anticipate, with patience she had not modeled. It had not fixed everything. It had not resolved every tension or erased every difficulty. There would be more sessions, more hard days, more moments where the gap between two ways of seeing the world felt very wide. But the framework existed now. The monitoring stations had a working protocol. The numbers were true. And across that docking corridor, the Drathin ambassador had smiled at him without performing it, which was not nothing. It was, in fact, quite a lot. He turned back into the ship. Donna Ruiz was leaning against the corridor wall with a mug in her hand, and an expression that meant she had been watching him stand there, and thinking something she was about to say. "Good dinner," she said. "Great dinner," he said. She raised her mug. Ambassador Veilka ate 3 portions of the roasted root vegetable thing. She said the sauce was good, Colin said. I know, Emilio told me immediately. He's been radiating satisfaction for an hour. Colin smiled. He walked back toward the observation bay to help with cleanup, and the ship hummed around him, steady and warm, and somewhere out through the hull the stars were doing what stars do, burning quietly, constant in the long dark, full of something that looked like patience from very far away. He picked up a folding chair and thought about the ratification session and what he would need to prepare. He thought about Subclause 19, still the most delicate of the resolved points, and whether the wording they had landed on would survive contact with both governments' legal teams, and what he would do if it didn't. He thought about Arev and his 47 questions, and whether there was a version of a joint survey program that could be proposed at the ratification stage, or whether that was moving too fast. He thought about Advocate Sharon and the closed acknowledgement, and the word in the Drathine language that did not translate, the one that sat between approval and gratitude, in a space that his own language apparently had not needed until now. He thought he might need it soon. He might need a lot of things he did not have words for yet. That was fine. He was learning. The folding chair went into the storage rack with a quiet click. He picked up another one. Outside the viewport at the far end of the room, the stars were still there, still steady, still doing what they had always done. He kept working,